April 28, 1945. The ground beneath Berlin trembled with the approaching Soviet artillery, a constant drumbeat of impending doom that signaled the final collapse of the Third Reich. In this apocalyptic landscape, within the claustrophobic confines of the Führerbunker 50 feet below the Chancellery Garden, Adolf Hitler made a decision that would forever puzzle historians. With Red Army soldiers perhaps just blocks away from his position, with his empire reduced to these few reinforced concrete rooms, the man who had orchestrated the deaths of millions decided to get married. This ceremony required an official, a man with specific legal authority to sanctify this union under German civil law. That man was Walter Wagner, an ordinary notary whose life was about to become permanently entangled with one of history's most monstrous figures. His story represents one of the final, bizarre acts in the Nazi tragedy, a wedding performed in the shadow of certain death, a legal formality observed while the entire structure of law and order collapsed into dust and rubble above them. This is the complete narrative of those final hours, told through the experience of the unexpected official who found himself at the very center of the storm during its devastating conclusion, a witness to the intimate moments preceding a dictator's suicide. Walter Wagner was, by every conceivable measure, a minor functionary in the vast Nazi bureaucracy, a man who preferred legal documents to battlefield commands. Born in 1907, he had joined the Nazi Party relatively early in 1931, finding his niche within the administrative apparatus of Berlin under Joseph Goebbels. When war erupted, his legal background placed him involved with resettlement programs in occupied Poland, where he met and married his wife, Cordula. By April 1945, his life had transformed dramatically. He was a new father to a baby son he had scarcely seen, and like nearly every able-bodied man left in the capital, he was conscripted into the Volkssturm, the poorly equipped home guard defending Berlin street by street. He was stationed in the Friedrichstrasse area, fighting with a rifle he barely knew how to use, a lawyer suddenly turned soldier in a lost cause. He could not have imagined that his specific notarial credentials, logged in some party registry, were about to make him indispensable to the Führer himself in history's most macabre marriage ceremony, summoning him from the front lines to the innermost sanctum of the collapsing regime for one final, surreal duty. The summons arrived on the evening of April 28th, a night lit by the constant flash of explosions and echoing with the crump of impacting shells. Hitler had informed his propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, of his intention to legally marry his longtime companion, Eva Braun. Goebbels, ever the diligent organizer even in total chaos, needed someone qualified to perform a civil ceremony. His mind turned to Walter Wagner, a notary he knew from the Berlin Gau administration. Immediately, an armored vehicle was dispatched through the deadly streets with orders to locate him. The Waffen-SS squad first went to his apartment, only to find he was at his combat position, engaged in the fierce street-to-street fighting. They eventually tracked him down, pulling him from the rubble and chaos, and rushed him through the apocalyptic landscape to the relative safety of the Reich Chancellery, and then down into the buzzing, oppressive depths of the Führerbunker. For a simple lawyer, the journey must have been terrifying and disorienting, a descent from one kind of hell into another, far more intimate and final one. The atmosphere inside the Führerbunker was a toxic mixture of despair, exhaustion, and surreal normality. The air was thick with the smells of diesel fuel from the generators, damp concrete, and human sweat. The low ceilings and cramped rooms created a claustrophobic pressure that weighed on everyone. Despite the 10-foot-thick concrete roof, the constant, shuddering impacts of Soviet shells were a relentless reminder that time was running out. Here, in this subterranean world, the last loyalists of the Nazi regime, Martin Bormann, Joseph and Magda Goebbels, secretaries, and a handful of officers, waited for the inevitable end. When Wagner was ushered in, still wearing his battle-soiled Volkssturm uniform, he entered a scene of profound psychological collapse. The man he was brought to see, the Führer, was a ghost of his former self, trembling, pale, and emotionally shattered. The absolute power Wagner had likely imagined was gone, replaced by a pathetic figure clinging to one last symbolic act. Upon his arrival, the ever-meticulous lawyer immediately identified a procedural problem. There was no proper marriage certificate or the official paperwork required for a civil ceremony. In one of the most astonishing moments of the entire episode, Wagner pointed out this deficiency to Goebbels and Bormann. Incredibly, they agreed. The same armored personnel carrier that had brought him was ordered to take him on a suicidal journey back through the firestorm of central Berlin to his office in the Pankow district to retrieve the necessary documents. This journey, through streets dominated by Soviet tanks and infantry, was an insane risk, undertaken purely for bureaucratic correctness. It underscores the Nazi obsession with form and procedure, even when the very concept of the state that created those procedures was ceasing to exist. The fact that Wagner survived this round trip is a miracle, and his willingness to return to the bunker speaks volumes about the power of command he still felt from those within. The ceremony itself was convened in the bunker's small map room, a cramped space dominated by a large situation map that graphically illustrated the hopelessness of their position. The time was just after midnight, officially marking the beginning of April 29, 1945. Adolf Hitler emerged from his private quarters, wearing his standard field gray uniform tunic. Eva Braun, in a stark contrast to the gloom, wore an elegant, long black silk dress, a final statement of the glamour and style she had always cherished. The witnesses, Joseph Goebbels and Martin Bormann, stood by as Walter Wagner, likely nervous and acutely aware of the absurdity of the situation, began the brief civil rites. He first asked the ritual questions required by law, confirming that both parties were of Aryan descent and free to marry. The question of Aryan purity, a cornerstone of Nazi ideology, was a grotesque formality in a bunker where that ideology was meeting its fiery end. There was no mention of the word love in the proceedings. This was a legal contract, not a romantic union. Following the verbal formalities, the bride and groom were required to sign the marriage certificate, the document for which Wagner had risked his life. Eva Braun, in a moment of poignant humanity, began to sign her new name. She instinctively started with Eva B. Before catching herself, crossing out the B with a determined stroke, and carefully writing Hitler, born Braun. This small, telling gesture revealed the significance of this moment for her. After more than 14 years as Hitler's largely hidden companion, she was finally achieving the status and recognition she had long desired, even if it came in the final hours of her life. Hitler signed with a noticeably shaky hand, a stark contrast to the bold, commanding signature he had once affixed to documents of state. With these signatures, the marriage was legally binding. Walter Wagner's primary duty was complete. He had officially married the Führer. The mood following the ceremony was anything but celebratory. The wedding party moved to Hitler's private sitting room, where a modest breakfast of sandwiches and champagne was served. The conversation was subdued, strained, and fragmented. There were no toasts to a long and happy future, for there was none to be had. Hitler reportedly spoke nostalgically about his early days in politics and the eventual downfall of his traitorous subordinates, Göring and Himmler. Eva Braun, now Frau Hitler, drank champagne and attempted to lighten the mood, encouraging others to at least taste the food. The gathering lasted less than an hour, a grim and joyless affair overshadowed by the unspoken knowledge of what was to come. For Walter Wagner, this was likely an intensely uncomfortable interlude, a moment suspended between his normal world and the certain death that permeated the bunker. Almost immediately after the somber wedding breakfast concluded, Hitler withdrew with his secretary, Trottel Jung, to an adjacent room. There, he dictated his last will and political testament, a document that railed against the Jews and sought to justify his actions, while formally expelling Göring and Himmler from the party and appointing Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz as his successor. This was the true business of the night. The wedding had been a personal prelude to this final political act. Meanwhile, Walter Wagner had no reason to remain. His unique role in the bunker's drama was over. He was dismissed, leaving the oppressive underground complex and returning to the surface, to the shattered, burning world of Berlin. He rejoined his Volkssturm unit at the Potsdamer Platz, transitioning back from being the Führer's marriage efficient to being a target for Soviet snipers and tanks. Less than 40 hours after Wagner performed the marriage ceremony, on the afternoon of April 30th, Adolf and Eva Hitler said their final farewells to the bunker staff. They then retired to Hitler's private study. Contemporary accounts, corroborated by forensic evidence, indicate that Eva Hitler bit into a cyanide ampule, while Adolf Hitler simultaneously shot himself in the head with his Walther PPK pistol. In accordance with Hitler's precise instructions, their bodies were carried up the bunker's emergency exit to the shell-cratered garden of the Reich Chancellery, placed in a shallow depression, doused with gasoline, and set ablaze as Soviet shells continued to rain down. The marriage that Wagner had legalized was ended not by divorce, but by a joint suicide, a final, violent act that ensured the world would never put the Führer on trial. The flames that consumed their bodies were the true end of the Third Reich. The fate of Walter Wagner was similarly grim, though far less documented. After leaving the bunker, he returned to the command of his Volkssturm company at the Potsdamer Platz. The fighting was utterly hopeless, a close-quarters slaughter against the battle-hardened Red Army. His friend and company commander, Erich Illing, was severely wounded by Russian tank fire. Wagner immediately assumed command of the decimated unit. He continued to lead the defense in the area around the Anhalter Bahnhof, a key transportation hub turned into a fortress of rubble. Sometime on April 30th, 1945, the very same day Hitler and his new wife took their own lives, Walter Wagner was killed in action. He was shot in the head during the fierce combat, and his body, like those of countless others in the final battle for Berlin, was never recovered or identified, vanishing forever into the chaos he had briefly escaped to go underground. In the immediate aftermath of the battle, the Soviet Union was initially secretive about the fate of Hitler. They promoted various conspiracy theories, suggesting he may have escaped, partly because they had not immediately found identifiable remains. It was only through meticulous forensic work by Soviet counterintelligence, including the matching of dental records to a jawbone fragment retrieved from the garden, that Hitler's death was conclusively confirmed. The story of the bunker wedding slowly emerged from the testimonies of survivors like Trottel Jung, Gerda Christian, and others who were captured by the Soviets and later released. For decades, Walter Wagner remained a shadowy, almost mythical figure in this story, a name without a face or a history, known only as the man who performed the strangest wedding of the 20th century. The decision for Hitler and Braun to marry was deeply symbolic for both parties. For Eva Braun, it was the ultimate validation of her lifelong devotion, a transformation from a secret mistress into the lawful wife of the Führer, granting her the status in death that she was denied in public life. For Adolf Hitler, it was a complex gesture. It was likely an act of gratitude and affection for Braun's loyalty, a reward for her decision to come to Berlin and die with him. But it was also a calculated move to create a facade of normality and bourgeois respectability in his final hours, to sanctify his relationship before composing his final political testament and committing suicide. This marriage ensured that the history books would record Eva not as his mistress, but as his wife, thereby burnishing his own desired legacy and providing a veneer of traditional morality to their final pact. The personal story of Walter Wagner was largely lost to history for over half a century. He was a name in a few memoirs, a footnote in history books. A significant breakthrough came in 2004, when investigative writer Ian Sayer published the first confirmed photograph of Wagner. The key to unlocking his story was a simple postcard. Sayer had purchased a postcard handwritten by Wagner on March 30, 1945, addressed to his wife, Cordula, on the North Frisian island of Föhr. At the top, someone had written the last card. The handwriting was so difficult to decipher that it took 22 years to fully translate its contents. This discovery eventually led Sayer to Wagner's son, Michael, who had been just an infant when his father died. This connection finally allowed the world to see the man behind the historical footnote, to understand him as a person with a family, hopes, and a life extinguished by the war he served. The legacy of Walter Wagner is profoundly ambiguous. He was not a war criminal, not a high-ranking Nazi ideologue, but a bureaucrat, a cog in a vast and terrible machine. His story is a powerful reminder that history is not shaped solely by the great and the monstrous, but also by the ordinary individuals who, through a twist of fate, find themselves participating in moments of world-shattering significance. He was a family man who performed one final, bizarre duty, a lawyer who insisted on the correct forms even as civilization crumbled. He walked into the heart of the Nazi darkness, applied the dry letter of the law to a situation of utter madness, and then walked back out to meet his own fate, becoming a permanent, if minor, character in the chilling final chapter of the Third Reich, the man who married Hitler.